Hello, welcome back everybody for another pregame discussion. It is game number 9 for the pregame discussion, and we're so close, almost done. It's been an amazing journey. Um, and really, when we talk about the state of the game right now, it is very close. Team DZ has 5 to Team Max 3, and the judges are now 4 of 8. They're must win out. They need the next two to stay alive, to hit that 6 mark. And of course, for Team Mac, it is now a must win. They have to win both to force a potential overtime, in which then they would have a chance to win it all there if they can even get to that point. So, Team DZ is now in a match point potential. Earlier today, it was Matt versus Schweppes. And Matt took the victory there with Rabbit, who was a judge who got that right, keeping his team alive. And it's really funny when you look at this game 9 and the players playing Vandy and Cape, two players that hadn't really been a part of the spec chat, more so really looking at past games or seeing the meta, if you will. So I think this is going to be one of those clean slate games where you can relate how they play and pinpoint and kind of match what persona does each player fit in with the previous rans of players of both Town and Mafia. And I think really the hands of the game, at least for Team DZ to get the potential match point, or even for Team Mac to stay alive, is in the hands of players that really are just going in fresh, their toes, just getting them in, just dipping them in on the surface. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun because I think we're going to see a lot of similarities, and I think it's going to be one where there's a lot of laughing. There's a lot of kind of, oh my god, I can't believe this happened. This is insane. Like a lot of back and forth kind of in that sense, and a lot of crazy shenanigans perhaps that we will witness in this game, and a lot of funny moments I think. And these are two players, Vandyfan and Cape, that have really when they play, they have a lot of memorable moments that we all remember for a long time. So I think it's gonna be exciting to see these two facing up, and obviously Shad, getting his opportunity at redemption in this game 9 in a must win for the judges, and to give his team a chance. So we'll get all to that later. But yeah, so, state of the game, Team DZ, match point, they're up 5-3. They win this, they win it all. Judges must win, they need to win the next two, including this one. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. And Team Mac, they need this one. So, we'll start off, with Vandy fan. Vandy is someone who I have the most experience with. I have played with him in video, and he's actually shout out to Vandy. He's one of the main reasons actually that I got into Forum, and more so that I got into Champs. So if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have played Champs in the first place, and never really wouldn't have experienced Mafia Universe. So kudos and shout out to him. But Vandy is a player. He's a tremendous. Like, he has a tremendous sweet spot, and he's a very nice guy, and it's just someone you love to play with. Really, has a lot of care for the game, and really always wants to be better. And I think, even though it might not show sometimes explicitly, but I think implicitly he always has a self-care to reevaluate and kind of relearn and learn from his mistakes and be better on it. And so, I think he's a player that you just love to keep around and just watch him grow and blossom. But for Vandy, he is a player as Town recently in a lot of Mafia games, even in the video games that we play. He's been miseliminated a lot as Town recently, and I think more so in MU, he has kind of become that shrug yeet Town at times, right? When Town don't really have a strong confident scum read, and he's kind of the chew toy for a lot of people, right? And then they tend to default scum read him, and so I think Vandy is someone who is inherently scummy as Town. I think it's more so because of the way that he kind of presents himself in the thread, and really kind of when he's on the phone, right? Because a lot of people are on the computers when they're posting. He's on his phone, and he gives a lot of one-liners, a lot of small takes, doesn't really go in depth as much, but he kind of speaks from his thoughts. He kind of speaks from what he believes in. And so I think, that, to me is really the make or break between how people kind of evaluate certain things is, hey, this guy is just giving a lot of one-liners, not really much backed up. It feels fake, and a lot of people think it feels phoned in, but really it's just he doesn't elaborate as much as people want him to. But he does kind of, have good surface level takes. Kind of goes into it. Also, what's up, Soy Online? For those watching the pre-recorded or the recorded after, this is always streamed on Twitch. So thank you for joining, watching. We're just kind of discussing about a Mafia game on forum, kind of doing a little podcast discussion about it. So yeah, but yeah, back to Vandy. He's a player who just, as we mentioned, he has a good heart, for the game, and he's someone as Town that gets scummered a lot. We mentioned, he posts a lot of one-liners. He's on his phone, but I think, the main thing about Vandy is as Town, he really makes an attempt to get an understanding of the game state, and really his reads, even though they might seem not authentic on the surface, he really kind of goes through the motions a lot and tends to kind of flip-flop and change, and kind of, based off what he sees or reads, he kind of has that implicit self-evaluation, and that's the thing, a lot of people don't see that evaluation, and they kind of, default scum read, as we discussed before. But Vandy, in beside his mindset and kind of how he approaches the game, he kind of does have that, you know, like authentic mindset to kind of evaluate. I think as Town, it's really more evident than when he's Mafia, right? Because as Mafia, his solve is a little more phoned in. He tries to focus more on the spew, kind of how he looks with players, and kind of, you know, he's also, as Mafia, he's started to become more of a bussable player, so he'll attract a lot of buses on him, and so thus as a result he tries to make focus on spew, to make others look good, and doesn't really push to solve as much with confidence. But as Town, he's someone who gives a lot of short takes, but they are takes that are generally backed up from implicit readings, and gives some surface level discussion with some reasoning, detailed reasoning at times. And so I think, when you look at how he plays, you have to really look at, hey, is Vandy solving in a manner that makes sense based off the content and the context that he's reading up, based off everything that he is, accruing and gathering in his mind. Does this solve make some sense, even though if he's not explaining it well, or if it's not as coherent to others to follow the thought process, which I think is the main drawback. But I think really, if you feel that this solve, at least on a surface level, if it makes sense, then it is more indicative of Town Vandy. And I think really the strong suit of Vandy, and it's very underrated, doesn't get talked a lot about, but usually Vandy, obviously people have good snap rates, but I think Vandy's first wolf snap read specifically, right? Not necessarily the Town, because sometimes he might Town read Mafia, but his wolf snap reads, the first initial ones, at least the first two, it will always contain a Mafia. His gut instinct is so good, and for someone who's been playing the game as long as he has really developed this kind of gut instinct where, based off how someone presents himself, gets in the thread, analyzing their motivation of whether this is performative or whether this is lackluster. Vandy does a great job of really picking out these players from the get-go, in his early reads, and getting a feel of whether or not their Town or Mafia. And his early wolf snap reads are pretty good, and this is evident in a couple games. We look at the game that just ended a while ago. I think it was the 18er game, or it was one that Benny hosted, and he was Town that got misaligned, and he suspected Neil, and Neil was Mafia. So it was a really good read, and for how he got there, from the beginning, which was a snap read. And we look at the other game that I hosted, Democratic Republic of Mafia. In game one, Vandy had a very early scum read on Rajade, through the the snap read motion. So his ability to really catch Mafia early on, and based off their motivation, which is so important, right? Because he analyzes behavior to get that gut instinct. So I think his behavioral analysis is really underrated for a player of his caliber. When people look into his reads, so his ability to catch on Mafia early is really good, and we see it in video too. He does a great job of it. So I think that's really part of Vandy's Town gameplay is at least in form, a lot of one-liners, but a lot of authentic thought processes that follow based off his reading and a constant fluidity and change, right? I think as Mafia we discusses, he's more of a basketball player. He kind of focuses more on spew to say things to look good for others and doesn't really focus as much on himself, and it kind of just repeats a lot, right? That's one of the things we discuss about in terms of objective Townie Wolfie tells us. Vandy is more repetitive, more over wordy as Mafia in the sense where he just tries to get the same point on and on again. But I think his Town, he has a much more dynamic mindset. He has a much more fluid mindset and willing to adapt and change a lot. And those reads change more on a dime more so as Town than as Mafia. So those are main things that are indicative. And really as we mentioned, as Mafia is a little more phoned in. More focused on spew, but based off his play style. But Vandy is someone who, as Town, appears more scummy, just on a surface level. But when you interact with him and ping him more, it's more readable to kind of get where he's coming from. And I think the biggest thing with Vandy too is he's a player that, as Town, he tends to lose some steam, but I think as Mafia, he loses a lot more steam early on, or sorry, not early on, later on as the game goes on. So it's again one of those things in the trenches where as the game continues on, his activity levels tend to drop a little more as Mafia. Especially we see this on video more so. He kind of does some interactions a little bit to appear towny to just do his thing and then kind of dips. So it's kind of like being in recency bias mode as Mafia, trying to do what he can, get Town rid, and then as soon as that happens, dip and let Town do whatever they need to kind of be chaotic or, fold via themselves without him having to do anything. But I think as Town, he's a lot more engaged and he's a lot more proactive. I think is a good word for it in terms of how he does presents his reads. Whereas Mafia is way less proactive and more focused on just kind of interactions for the sake of interacting to just get a free pass or standby. But I think, in this specific game, when you look at how it is Vandy coming to the thread, I think it's very important to see how does he approach Cape, right? I think more so how does he approach Cape and how does he ping out and what does he do, right? Because I think, Vandy is able to somewhat project Town, even though it's been somewhat tough. But I think he's a player as Mafia who's very good at being deceptive and very good at, being cunning. But I think really it's more indicative to see how does he pick apart Cape. What parts of his posting does he do, and how does he feel confident about it, right? Obviously we discussed this before, but usually the Mafia don't really Town claimer, they don't really push as hard as the Town do. They have that frog in a leaf strategy. They don't feel that same entitlement as Mafia that the Town do. And so I think it's really important, as Vandy is someone who does have that somewhat Town entitlement as the game goes on, and especially when he feels like he's done something within the game to push a Mafia or push an agenda that's pro Town, he feels very, very confident in his ability to not die, and that he should not get miseliminated. So I think what's going to be interesting to see here is how does he pick apart Cape, and how does he attempt to persuade the judges that I'm not a good option, I am obvious Town for X, Y, and Z reasons, and Cape is Mafia because of these early games interactions or because of how he posts in or stuff like that. And we discussed about the early snap wolf reads, and Vandy is a great behavioral mindset. So I think really, it's going to be interesting to see how Vandy kind of picks apart Cape early on, and as someone who does have those good early wolf snap reads. And we discuss about this all the time. The other players knows their win con. They know that they have to get the other player out. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how he goes about attacking Cape and what specific things he picks up on, because those things are going to be telling whether or not they're wolf motivated and whether they're phoned in or forced, or whether they're authentic and he's actually coming from a mindset of, hey, this guy is slipping up, this guy is from a behavioral standpoint, he's being too performative, or he's being overwordy, he's being over analyzes, he's being too memey. So he, you expect Vandy to come up with these early shotguns of attacking Cape and seeing how he does it. I think that's going to be alignment indicative more so than how he presents himself, because we discussed about this before. Vandy is someone who has appeared scummy as Town and Mafia, and it's really because of his presentation with the one-liners and sometimes the lack of explanation. But for a better word, it's not as elaborated as people want it to be. But there is an implicit focus of how he gets his reads through the context and reading, and he does explain it on, as we mentioned, through the one-liners. in front. But I think how he goes about casing Cape, just talking about himself. I think those are going to be very telling for Vandy. And so I think he's got a tough match, and we talked about this too, Vandy. We saw him change his profile picture to Mac, and he's kind of honoring in Mac's honor for this game. So you know you just want to give Mac a chance, right? And Vandy in the back of his mind knows this game is for Mac. This game is, I need to win this to give my team a chance. This isn't about me. This isn't about proving myself. This is about helping my team, give them a chance, give them an out to at least survive for another day. And I think Vandy, knowing that mindset and feeling the pressure on him, I think he's going to step up to the plate and do what he needs to do to perform at a high level and do the best he can. Because, when the going gets tough, expect Vandy to come out and do what he needs to do, to get his agenda through and to just have that, extra whim, give in to him and just do what he needs to do. And unfortunately, there are times where Vandy gets busy and gets caught up with IRL stuff. But I think really when, as we mentioned, when everything, is thrown on him, when the pressure gets hot, the pressure gets high, I think expect Vandy to step up to the plate and swing a home run and do what he needs to do to really help his team win, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's just about surviving another day, giving your team a chance to at least tie the game. And I think Vandy knows this in the back of his head. And really, when he's playing with motivation for someone, I think you're going to see him step up and do a lot more than what he normally does. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how this extra whim or this extra motivation for this game for Vandy is going to stack up with how he presents himself and goes against Cape, and more so kind of picks apart the early behaviors in Cape and how he goes about doing that. I think those are going to be very telling and fun to watch. And when you look at the other side in Cape, Cape90, just like Vandyfan, it doesn't get discussed so much, but he's also someone who is also wolfy as Town, right? So you have these two players who are as wolfy as Town, and it's kind of at the end of the day thinking like, damn, if this player is Town here, are they just Mafia? Because these players are both capable of posting Towny posts as Mafia or having Towny tone, and Cape is someone who's really good. I mean, really good at fooling people, especially in turbos, right? Those are faster paced games, but his ability to kind of be able to project some level of towniness or have some, good towny structured posts and having a towny tone in under pressure is so key, right? Especially in these games where it's kind of going back and forth and you're interacting with the judge constantly and you're interacting with the player. It's so important to have that self-appearance to be towny, right? Because that's one of the two ways to win the game is either you're towny than the other person or the other person's scummier. And I think Cape is someone who's really good at masking his play, especially as Mafia, to appear towny. But I think, when you discuss about, well, why are these players as Mafia townier and as Town scummier? Well, let me tell you why. It's because the way these players come through their thought process and the way they describe their thoughts is so messy and so broken at times that you scum read it because it just feels inauthentic. But these players have such a scattered mindset and such a huge spew of thoughts that on surface level it feels wolfy, but really it's just a Town that is giving all their thoughts and discussing everything they have. And Cape is someone who is very, very concise as Town and someone who is very outspoken in the sense where he'll give out as many thoughts and he'll keep, he's someone who's like Vandy, very flip-floppy at times in a way that is, messy, tiny projection. He is also someone who gets paranoid a lot, right? He doesn't leave any stone unturned, so he always, looks to certain avenues and constantly always reevaluating, right? Always that gears turning. And so these characteristics, though they may appear scummy for how they get performed, the actual like goal or the actual motivation behind them isn't as scummy, and it's pro towny, but the way it's executed appears that way. But their actual thought process and how they go about it and their their goal in mind with what they're doing is a towny motivation. And so that's why this ideology of towny players being wolfy, but when they're Mafia they be towny, is because they're more careful and they're more self-aware as Mafia to have towny sounding posts, but as Town they're spewing so many thoughts, and the execution and the manner it gets done sometimes can be messy and can appear scummy. And I think really that shows in some of Cape's play is when you see some of his reads, especially in turbos, when he goes to them or how quickly he changes progression or how quickly he changes a read, you're like, damn, like, is this guy Mafia? Like, this seems opportunistic. But no, it's really, when you look at the context, when you look at how they evaluate, especially for Cape, it is Townie based off how they approach it, and how they reevaluate their read, right? If it's in a way that they're able to explain at least somewhat, and it tracks up based off their previous experience, whether it be meta or some behavior that pinged them, or some game state implication. I think that's really how you're able to determine whether or not those changes, or those change on the dimes and read, or those whether or not they are Townie or not. And as we mentioned, Cape very good at sounding Townie as Mafia, but also appears scummy as Town at times. And I think Cape is a player who is able to evaluate a lot and is able to constantly change. And as you mentioned, he's very paranoid as well, and makes sure he doesn't leave any stone unturned. But I think the biggest thing too, especially in these games, and we discussed about the drawback that these players haven't really spectated as much, or haven't really seen what's going on, is Cape is a player who we have seen at times have funny moments in terms of slipping. Okay, so in the game that I hosted for the Super Mafia All-Star setup, we saw Cape have a little slip moment. We saw Cape kind of mess up a little bit in regards to when kind of just going through the motions, right? This is what we discussed about. The reads are authentic, whether or not there's actual motivation behind the way they change the read and how they evaluate it. But if it is so phoned in, and if it feels more consensus or more going with the motion, in the game, Mac was Town and Cape was Mafia. Cape was discussing with Mac, kind of scumrating him a little, going back and forth, and then he towered him, and he didn't even read the Vokaru despite saying he liked it, and it really showed based off how he went off the post. And then it kind of created this funny moment where Cape basically scum slipped in a way where he didn't read the Vokaru at all, and kind of got caught, and really, you know, for Cape, there are some times where he has these perspective slips or lapses, and you have to be careful about that, right? Especially in this game where you do have TMI in the sense where you know the other player's alignment and you know what your win con is, but sometimes your win con and your TMI, as if you're Mafia, can kind of, you can have a perspective facade where you say something which implicates against you, and then you kind of get caught for it. So I think Cape has got to be careful of this, in the sense where you don't want to, make a slip up. You don't want to say something that points the fingers back at you, and so I think something to look at is, how does Cape present himself? Right, we talked about how does Vandy push Cape, but I think really for Cape is, how does he present himself? How does he interact in the thread? And because his perspective is one where I think as Town he demonstrates, well, as Town it's easier to see whether he lacks TMI or not, and as Mafia it's easier to see whether he has TMI. But obviously in this game we mentioned, both players have TMI. So the biggest thing is then you look at their perspective and how they maintain it, right? Because at the end of the day, Mafia are informed. They know the other player's alignment. So whether or not that alignment gets broken and becomes inconsistent with their supposed perspective of what they're supposed to maintain, I think that's going to be very telling for Cape. And as the pressure goes there, it'll be interesting to see how he does it. Because remember, this game, there's less pressure on Cape, right? Because your team is up 5-3. You have a game point of 2 games potentially, and there's not much pressure on you. Instead, there's more pressure on Vandy to get the win and keep their team alive. So I think for Cape, really, this lack of pressure in a way is going to help him kind of not feel the need to over explain his perspective or do something that might actually implicate him. And so I think if you're Vandy, you got to attack that a lot, and you kind of got to be in his face, to kind of force potential misslips or some mishaps in perspective. Regardless of whether Vandy's Town or Mafia, you got to put some pressure on Cape to make him feel a little uncomfortable. But I think as we mentioned, Cape, it'd be interesting to see how he presents himself, whether or not his perspective will be consistent with how he maintains his presence in thread, or whether or not, if he's Mafia, if there's a slip up or not. But those evaluations and how Cape presents himself, I think is going to be very alignment indicative and very telling of how he goes about discussing, himself, and kind of discussing about how he feels about Vandy, and when discussing with the judge about pointing certain implications or fingers in that direction. So I think that's going to be very telling. And we talk about he's a little more outspoken as Town, and so it'll be interesting to see really how does Cape provide all his thoughts, and really what does he provide, right? Like, not necessarily is it surface level Wolfie, but does it make sense? Does it track with his perspective? Does it feel authentic, or does it feel just kind of like, oh, I'm just doing this to do it? And I think we are going to see some of these objective Wolfie tells in this game specifically. The Townie entitlement of Town, the and I don't know if I say yeah. So like the objectively Townie or Wolfie tells. So like yeah, the Townie entitlement. Whether the Wolf feels like they're backed in a corner, they can't really push. Frog in a leaf. Kind of does the player who's town claim back to that Town entitlement. So I think really these tells are going to show in this game, and I think given the history with how these players had been, I think it's going to be very telling and key to kind of line into solving in between these two. Not necessarily from a meta perspective when you analyze Vandy or Cape, but from an objective perspective of how are these players playing and kind of what alignment do they each align with based off the way they presented themselves and based off the way they attacked one another. And I think the judge Shad, he's someone who did game two, unfortunately got it wrong when he voted Evacu over Prince. But I think really Shad is now up for the challenge. He feels very confident in his ability, and I think a lot of the judges have been hyping him up, and he's been discussing, and they've been kind of, according to my sources, been trying to figure out, tells or certain things to evaluate, and really, the judges are focused on, hey, evaluate on X, Y, and Z, and trying to get as prepared as much as possible. And I think for Shad, he's going to come into this game with a lot more motivation. He wants to do what he can for his team to keep it alive. And remember, we discussed about Vandy trying to give Team Mac a chance and give Mac an opportunity in the captain's battle to at least tie the game if it does get there. And for Shad, you want to do the same for your team and to help Alexa, give her a chance in game 10 potentially if you are able to win this game, and give your judges a chance to win the game, right? Because at the end of the day, it's a team game, right? You can have good individual statistics or records, but at the end of the day, if your team doesn't win, what difference does it make? It doesn't matter how well you do individually. So I think as a team, it is just so important to just give your team a chance, do the best you can, and help them and give them a chance to help win it all together, right? It's not a one-man show, it's a team show, and I think Shad knows this, and he's going to do everything he can in his power to help win this game for the judges. And I think really the biggest thing is you always learn from your mistakes, and we discussed about Shad and his ability in these F3 situations. I think Shad learning, especially getting the experience, right? He was game two. It was early on. It was early on in the games. There wasn't as much meta in terms of how do the Wolves or Town objectively interact. Now that Shad has this info, and we discuss how Shad is a fantastic player of analyzing, especially in these Lalo situations, of how do players and their behaviors, how is their subconscious acting, Mafia or Town. I think he's going to do a great job of matching these objective Wolf Town tells with these players and matching, hey, how does Vandy interact in the thread? How does Cape interact in the thread? Is this a Townie or a Mafia mindset from Vandy? Or is this a Townie or Mafia mindset from Cape? And I think Shad having that utility and ability now in hindsight, seeing how everyone acts, and we talk about this game with two players who haven't really spectated as much, and we expect to see some of those objective tells in this game. I think Shad is going to make up and kind of avenge himself for that game two, and give his judges a chance to go into game 10 with a chance to win the game. And I think he's going to do a much better job this game, and with that understanding of before and the past, he's going to apply that to this game. And I think he's going to really take advantage. And he does have some experience with Vandy and Cape as well, which helps from the meta aspect. But I think, we discussed about Shad is a great player in terms of just dismissing players and looking just solely at their behavior and mindset and whether or not it aligns with a Town or Mafia behavior. And I think Shad is going to take full responsibility, accountability, and he's going to do the best he can in evaluating. So I think it's going to be really a close game, and I think it's one where there's a lot of pressure on Team Mac to get back in this game and try to do the best they can to tie it, and there's pressure on the judges to win this game and give themselves a chance to win it in game 10 potentially if they can win it here. So I think a lot on the line, a lot at stake for judges, Team Mac, and even for Team DZ, right? You don't want to give the opportunities to the team to come back. You want to finish it sooner, right? If you don't finish it, bad things can happen. I think there's just so much focus on getting the job done now, right? You talk about, finishing your opponent when you have them when you have them right where you want them, and now's the time to do it, right? So you got to take advantage of those opportunities, because if you let them slip away, you're going to be in big trouble. And so I think Vandy, Cape, and Shad, they all understand the position they're in right now, and they are going full, in focus on what they need to do, what their motivation is, what they need to achieve. And I think they're going to go out there and do the best they can. I think it's going to be a fun game. I think it's going to be one where, there was some history with Vandy and Cape. We talked about the Democratic Republic Mafia game where Vandy ended up feeling a little betrayed by Cape after he voted SPF, and Cape voting wrong on SPF kind of wants that revenge and wants to kind of feel good about maybe potentially getting it on Vandy this time and getting the one up, or Vandy wants to get back at Cape for what happened. So I think there is some history there where the other player wants the edge over, and I think it's gonna be a lot of fun to see how these guys combat and go at each other. And two players that are scummier as town. I think it's gonna be fun to see how it goes. And I think Shad is in for a tough task, but I think given the past and what he's able to do, I think he's gonna take advantage and do what he needs to do. It's a huge game 9. A lot on the line. Your great players got to show up, and we're gonna see who's great. These players at the end of the day have a lot on the line for this game. Not only for themselves but for their teams, and I think they'll all understand that. I think it's gonna be a great close game. I'm excited to see what they do and how they perform. So yeah, see you guys there. Peace.